So now we will hide off and let you talk. 30 minutes plus question and answer. And then,
thank you. Let me just share the presentation here. Can everybody see this?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here. It's always interesting to meet the open source community in various different places all over the world, even though currently it's all virtual. So I'm doing this from my office, as you see behind me. But it's great that we can still get together instead of all staying at home. What I'll be talking about today is kind of the other aspect of open source, right? It's great to hear about technology. It's great to hear about collaboration, how we can build software together. But in the end, economic aspects still control much of where the world is heading. And that means it's important to understand what role open source plays in the economy and what value it brings. And that can, for example, help to answer questions like the age-old question of how do I make money with open source, which, just to put this up front, so stupid question, that's the wrong question to ask. So who am I before we begin? Oh, wait. I'm an open source contributor for a very long time. I started as a software engineer on the KDE project in '97, and initially really worked in open source as a hobbyist. I coded, and then I started being a community representative and a board member for that community. And over time, my work has changed a little bit from coding, which I still love to do, to all those non-technical aspects of open source, which apparently, it's interesting because there are many of them and they're important and they receive very little attention. So questions like, how does open source interact with patents? Or questions like, how does open source interact with standards development? They receive very little attention by the community because they're also not at the heart of what the community does, but they can have massive impact on the world. I'm advising the United Nations Technology Innovation Labs on open source, and since recently, I work on the open source strategy for Ambition. So first, this is an interesting statement to make, right? There is no open source economy. There is no special economy, or there are no special economic principles that apply to open source. Everything we do is part of the overall flow of things. We produce, we consume, we share with others, we trade. What's different about open source is how we share the results of our work. What is different is not that what we create has effort that goes into that creates the value in the product, and that it needs time to do, and that most of the value is actually realized by trading. But if you, for example, read some classic economics books about value generation, trading, the role of money, etc., all of that still applies to the open source economy. There was some kind of weird development in the dot-com era where people thought likes and followers are currency. In a way, that's true, but it's a proxy currency, right? It's value through attention. But in the end, if you think about what changes the world, attention is not the currency, right? Right now, the currency is innovativeness in creating vaccines. And a lot of this is done under open source licenses or creating ventilators, right? And that's value. And the question is, how can we encourage such collaboration so that our society benefits from it? For that, you need trained economists because there's no special open source economy. What is economics? Before we begin, there are probably 100 different answers, but this is my answer, right? Economics studies how our societies produce and trade goods, and how the actors that are involved in that make decisions. And these decisions, we assume, are usually in their enlightened self-interest, but the self-interest of the person and the overall aggregated interest of society may deviate, or may be the same. And that's kind of where it becomes, where it goes tricky. In any case, how do we place open source in here? Well, we produce, right? Open source is software. Software is a virtual good. It's a information good, so that has some special attributes, but it's a good in the economic sense. It has value because we exchange it, and the person that receives it feels that this is tangible, right? You can use it, and it makes you happy, so it has value. Did you pay for it? No. That's actually interesting, because from an economic perspective, nothing's really about money. Everything is about goods and value. Because money is just a proxy in how we exchange these goods. We can use money to make the trading smoother, but in the end, everything is about creating tangible things. You can phrase all economic discussions very, very simply this way. It's how can the harvest be divided? First, we have to make a harvest that we can produce open source software, and then we can discuss who should have access to it, who should get how much. So keep that in mind for every economic discussion. This is what is behind it. But that was all very generic. This was all introduction. How do we position free and open source software in the non-technology fields of society? I think there are three interactions that stand out that are of special importance. The first one is with law. Why? It's quite obvious. All our licenses are based on copyright. The authors, if you write code, or if I write code, we gain copyright in what we create. And by releasing the code under a free software license, we say, you can use this according to the permission I give. And this is a principle in our society, is that you need the explicit permission of the author to use somebody's work. And so open source licenses made this very simple. We can easily attach an open source license to a piece of code, and that means everybody has permission to use it. But that means that everything we do in open source, in terms from a legal perspective, is traditional copyright law, is based on original copyright law. And there are some other obligations that the authors can attach to the code, but it's all anchored in this agreement between you as the user and the other person as the author. So it's a branch of private law. When you look at politics, that's also an age-old question, right? Is free software, free and open source software, is that a pragmatic way to develop where we all have fun in creating cool things? Or is it a social movement that changes society for the better? The real question for me is, can you separate these two things? I don't think we can. Of course, the overall global community is a social movement, and we can see that from the impact that the community had on our societies. If you look at how many times the term open source was used in the recent virus crisis, you realize what kind of impact we have in society. The expectation that open source has set in free sharing, in joint collaboration, collaborative innovation, have changed the expectations in science, and how we deal with data, public data, how we innovate, how academic results are transported into society, etc. So of course, open source or free software is a social movement, but it's also a great way to collaborate. And I think if we would take away the cool and smooth collaboration that open source enables, well, it just wouldn't happen, right? If it would be really cumbersome, nobody would do it. And therefore, these are two sides of the same medal. You can't separate them. But this also means that there's a massive impact in politics. And you can tell from the interest that also policymakers have in terms of how open source affects their societies. For example, the European Commission is currently running a study on the economic impact of open source on innovativeness of the European economy. I'm part of the team that works on this. It's pretty good, pretty cool. And economics. So this is all about economics in the end. So I already mentioned open source software is a kind of good. We produce it, we trade it, and it only has value if we distribute it. Do you remember that all open source licenses, they attach on distribution? Like when you distribute the code, other people can use it. That's where it becomes valuable. That's trading, right? So it's an inherent part of our economy. And another inherent aspect of economy is competition. I produce something, somebody else produces something, they offer the same use, then we are competing. So open source competes with other open source goods, but also competes with private goods. For example, if a business produces a software solution and the open source community produces another one, and they can be used for the same things as replacements. There also is an interesting interaction with the state, because the role of the state is to produce public goods, roads, education, health systems. And open source is also a public good because of the licensing. And that means all of a sudden we have two entities that are completely differently organized, that are both provisioning public goods for everybody. So far, this hasn't resorted to getting the pitchforks out and burning each other at the stake, but there is a potential conflict between the state and the open source community as well. Overall, I think the question at the end, this is a net positive. Everything we produce in the open source community is available to everybody and we don't hurt anybody. So the assumption is that the overall impact on society is a positive one. But it's difficult to measure because we're not paying taxes on it. There are two independent perspectives in the open source community that are sometimes convoluted and put together and considered to be the same thing. And that is creating and distributing open source products versus developing in collaborative processes. But these are two, it's almost like a coordinate system. And you have two dimensions. You have software freedom and open collaboration. And these are two separate things. Software freedom is expressed in licenses. And so basically, that's why we say it doesn't matter how a piece of software is produced, as long as it is under an open source license that is accepted by the open source definition, the open source initiative, according to the open source definition, it's an open source product. This product can be developed in-house by a company. It can be developed by a volunteer community. It's the license that matters on this axis, on the axis of software freedom. If you look at how the software is developed, that's a totally different story, because we have expectations that software is developed in a way that I can participate in. That has nothing to do with software freedom, really. That's a question of governance. And so that's why these are two, if you imagine a coordinate system, software freedom and transparency, openness, and collaboration are two separate dimensions. We also have different roles that open source products play in the economy. I think it's quite normal now that we consider free and open source software as foundational technologies. If you think of the operating system, I think it's the quintessential foundational technology. Every device needs one. Your users, for the most part, don't care what it is. We call it non-differentiating. It's cool to have an open source operating system, but most people don't even know about what their devices run. And there are many building blocks like this, the C library, a Bluetooth stack, things like that. All devices need them. And they're basically little modules, little bricks that you can put together to make a device. It's a platform that you build upon. Then we have consumer products, which are end user facing. And these products, users actually do see, they understand what they're using. And the current situation in the market is that here we have a mix of free and proprietary products. And many proprietary products today, however, use open source foundational technologies. So this is like the software stack from the bottom to the top. And the further you get towards the user, the closer you are to being a consumer product or being like providing consumer facing functionality. And the further down you go in the stack, the more open source you find. The further up you go, sometimes less, and then more proprietary code. And this perspective of the software stack is complemented by services. And services are incredibly important because we have this age-old saying that open source is there for everybody to use and to adapt to their needs and to further develop. But if we're honest, most users wouldn't be interested or capable of changing the code to make it better. That's a they're invited. We're happy for them to do it, but most people are not interested in it. They're not software people, right? Most people in the world are not software people. It's maybe a good thing to learn. And that means services, which are usually commercial services, like custom development, they actually implement that vision of open source, that it's adaptable by everybody, right? If I'm a business, I don't know, I make rubber boots, not software, but I need software and I need it adapted, I go to a service company and I hire them to change the code for me or to run it. And this is why we have two kinds of services. We have horizontal services, which are complementary. They are about the product. For example, custom development, adding a feature, fixing bugs, but not implementing that into, for example, consumer-facing products. And then they have vertical integration. This is the, if you imagine an industry, at the end, if you're accessing a web shop, the web shop uses open source technology as its foundation. That is vertical technology. What you as the consumer interact with is not software. You interact with the shop. And that means in the value chain, right, we are aggregating towards the top and higher level functionality. And this is, if you think about this, this allows you to place many businesses that have open source value propositions in this matrix, right? They're producing foundational technologies to make consumer products like telephones or embedded systems. They're providing horizontal services like custom development, or they do vertical integration, for example, by providing cloud-hosted Linux instances. A lot of existing businesses can be placed in such a matrix. And that brings us to this question of how do you make money with open source? I heard this so many times that I find it slightly annoying today. The reason is that I really believe it oversimplifies the question of regarding everything I've laid out so far. There is also a dimension of how can you benefit from free and open source software. And this dimension doesn't stop at the point of zero where you make no money. It goes all the way to negative. And that means you can either use free software to save a lot of money and economically benefit from it, or you can use free software because money is not important to you. You are, for example, pushing something else. I will give you an example in a minute. Or you can use it to sell services or sell products and make money. But this is a continuum. This is not something that begins at zero and goes all the way to positive. And I would posit that most of the large-scale free and open source software projects that we see today are in the saving money space. There are industry collaborations, for example, where the industry shares research and development costs to develop interesting products. If you look at Kubernetes, one of my favorite projects, because it's technically very cool, it is an industry consortium that also invites academics and volunteer developers to jointly generate technology that everybody can use. No individual company could easily have developed it because it's massively expensive and complicated. So it's a question of saving money by shared research and development expenses, and also attracting the right talent and the ingenuity of the people involved. So would the companies that are investing into Kubernetes benefit from it? Of course they do. They run it in their data centers, or they run mission critical stock trading systems on it. Sure. Do they make money with it? No, because that's not their point. They're saving money with it. And I think that's the other, if you take anything away from this presentation, that's the other most important thing, is that how do I benefit from it is a continuum, it's a spectrum that goes from all the way from saving money to making money. And I said, I'll give an example for what happens at the point of zero. Point of zero just means you don't care about revenue. It has your investment into open source has another benefit to you. Think about how Google develops Chrome as an open source product. They're not making money with it directly. They're not saving money with it because they have to develop the browser by themselves. But what Google does, it markets and advocates its other services with it. So it's not, the product itself neither makes money or saves money. It's an investment. But then Google benefits from that in a different way. So all possible positions on the spectrum do make economic sense depending on the situation. If you put this into a traditional perspective of who does what in the economy, we have trading based on price, and we have trading based on, for example, provisioning by the state. We have centralized and decentralized solutions, and this goes back to Ronald Coase. And in this matrix, there's a gap, and that gap's called peer production. That is Yochai Benkler's theory. The papers are public, you can read them, open access. So basically, the way we produce open source software and other collaborative creation of information goods fills a gap in our traditional processes of how we produce in the economy. And that's why it's valuable, because this gap where peer production happens today, peer production is the economic term for the open source collaborative processes. This gap, there was no production before, because it's impossible to do at a large scale without the internet. So the internet made it happen. And now we have global collaboration on software, and it has economic impact where previously this was a blank spot. And that's why open source successfully contributes positively to the economy. The questions that we discussed today still, for example, what's the economic benefit, what's the economic impact, etc., of open source on the economy? This question has been asked from the start, like since open source became popular. So Steven Weber, for example, phrased it as a good business model in open source is simply one that succeeds in creating additional value at the edge of the commons. And that's something that we keep saying today still. You can't make money with open source because open source is free. You put it under a free license, right? Everything you try to restrict the use of the software is a restriction of software freedom. Why do you put your software under an open source license in the first place if you don't want to tell users, but you can only use it if you buy a commercial license from me? That's nonsense. So one of the key things to keep in mind here is that once something is free in open source software, it's free for everybody. You can't take it back because every person that receives it from you can redistribute it to the whole world. So unless you can control the whole internet and erase every copy of the software, it's out there and you can't take it back. That's also, I mean, if you even try that, that's the old bait and switch model, right? You feed people with a bait product and then you switch them to a commercial license. You can try it. It wasn't the most successful approach in the last couple of decades. Which means if you think of building value and economically benefiting from open source software, then you need to think about where the value that you want to realize can be located. And that's always at the edge. We call it the commons, is the pool of public goods. And you have to be useful at the edge of that where private business begins again. So how can we do that? It's not impossible. We have a couple of institutions and processes in the open source environment that are extremely valuable. And I think one of the most valuable ones is what we call the global upstream downstream network, which is basically actually a global collaboration. If you ever wonder how a Linux distribution actually is created and who is involved, and if you would draw a map of everybody who has contributed to it, you would go insane, right? Because we have literally global collaboration. We have contribution from all over the world, and the upstream communities are focusing on individual products, and then they release them, and the next products use them as dependencies, and this all trickles down the stream until it's integrated into something like a device image, a Linux distribution, etc. But if you install a Linux distribution on your computer, you're literally using software made by thousands and 10,000s of authors. And in the old days, before the internet, people would have looked at this and said, how is that even possible? How do you coordinate that? You need a standards development organization to coordinate such a kind of work, or something like that. And the answer is, actually, open source licensing and open collaboration makes this all possible without negotiation, without patents, and without standards development. And that's one of the key contributions that open source makes on innovation, is that it enables global collaboration without the need for central authority and central coordination. What we're talking here about value at the edge of the commons. So I already laid out how services can be complementary or vertically integrating or related to open source products. You can make products that integrate open source. Every mobile phone today is like that, right? So that would be the open source foundation is part of the commons, and then your thin layer on top that the user sees is the value that the business creates. Yeah, the rest goes a little deep, so I'm going to speed up a bit because we're running out of time. Differentiation is mentioned here. This is interesting. I think I used the term a couple of times. Differentiation is the aspects of products that we create that make consumers buy our products and not the ones of our competitors. And that's interesting if we speak about free software, because the code that we use is by definition available to everybody. Can it differentiate? No. It's super innovative. It is very new. It's the state of the art. It's the edge, right? But since everybody has access to it, no business can differentiate by saying, I am using Linux. That maybe worked 15 years ago, but today everybody says, yeah, so do I, right? So no. That's sometimes, especially if you come from a software engineering background, as do I, that hurts a little bit because we fall in love with our products. We create code, we think it's very, very cool. And but our consumers, they don't necessarily care. They say, your Bluetooth doesn't work. The only thing I care about, I'm going to buy the other phone because I can't connect to my speaker. And it was a little bug in the code. Yeah, that's what users care about. So in the end, even if it's hard, it's important to keep in mind that this kind of differentiation that makes us choose one product over the other is clearly in the eye of the consumer, the buyer of the product. And we need to focus on the things that matter to them. There's a question that's always asked, and that is, what's the role of the volunteer community in all of this? Because it sounds all very businessy. It all sounds very industrial. And it's true that many of the contributions today come from industry contributors. So many companies have staff that are working on open source projects. And it's important to see that if you're paying a salary to somebody, it's actually the company that contributes. The person does the work. But that shouldn't discount the role of the volunteer community, because what made open source successful was the volunteer community. And the reason for that is that it's incredibly competitive, right? Volunteers do things like they look at a piece of code and they say, this can be done better. That's icky. That's bad code. I can spend a weekend to rewrite that piece in the most beautiful way. And a company would never do that because it's a crazy investment, right? Because you're improving a small marginal feature and you spend 2 days on it. But volunteers do that. And this is what made open source stable, what made it very powerful, and actually what made it industry grade, right? So it's important to keep in mind that if we want to keep the innovativeness of the upstream downstream network, we need to maintain a healthy relationship with involving volunteers, getting people to work on all aspects of the code. And that actually is in business interest. So there's an interest for large businesses to foster and encourage the volunteer open source community. This relates a little bit to competition. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because that would be another talk. But I already said that within the open source community, the sub-elements of the wider community are very competitive, right? You see that by projects replacing other projects, and users also migrating very quickly from one solution to the other if the other solution is clearly better. But also, so that's within the community. And I think what makes the community very innovative is that a bad solution tends to always get replaced. by a better one. And it doesn't necessarily need to make economic sense to do so, because there are some volunteers that say, this can be done better, so I will do it better. That's great, because that's what keeps it clean and really squeaky. All right. So a little more tangible for those of you that are, for example, thinking about creating products based on open source. This all boils down to 3 questions that we need to ask for every product. The first question would be, what's the revenue model? I said the revenue system we talk about is a spectrum: saving money, I don't care about money, making money. And the first question you need to answer for what you're creating is, where on this spectrum do I sit? Because, for example, if it's about saving money, you need to attract contributors, other people to share the cost with you. If it's about making money, you need to make sure that you can actually sell something, which usually contradicts the idea of having other contributors. And it's not very open sourcey. The second question you should ask is, what kind of good is it? Is it a service? Is it a horizontal complementary service, or is it a vertical integration? Is it a foundational technology, or is it consumer facing? Why do you need to ask this question? Because it's super important to understand whether you're offering a service or a product. And I'm going to have another slide where we can break this down. And because the way your system, your business operates is completely different, right? Because one sells billable hours and the other one sells units. Very important. And the question of what kind of good is it? Is it a foundational technology or is it consumer facing? Has to do with differentiation. Because if you're consumer facing, you need to differentiate. If you're foundational technology, you do not. And that leads us to differentiation. So the third question you need to answer is, what is different about my product? Why would a consumer come to me and buy the product from me? Why would the consumer not simply take the community release that I have never touched? Or use a different product, a commercial product, or a product by a different open source community? And very interesting here, the answers are not always technical. The answers may be related to governance. For example, how many contributors does your open source product have? If I'm a consumer and I'm a large company and I'm going to run internal infrastructure, I shy away from products that have 1 contributor. I'm still antsy about products that have 3 contributors. Products that have 50 different contributing companies and 500 contributors, I happily use. Because I'm assuming that if one company loses interest, the other ones are still there. And I'm also not running the risk of taking over, like being the effective maintainer of the software, if I start contributing, the others are going away. Because that's basically a commitment I have to make then. Quite interesting. So this is now a 3-dimensional mental coordinate system of how you would classify open source based value propositions. I said products versus services, and there are very different ways of explaining that, like what the difference, and this is really terminology. So you will probably find other terminology in maybe even economics books. But the way I use these terms is, to sell a product requires the right to do so. That means if you own a car, you can sell it. If you can sell licenses to proprietary software, it's a product. If you repair cars, you don't need to own the cars, so you're offering a service. And that means you can offer services without owning the product. In the open source context, that means you can offer custom development of code that you don't own. But you can sell it. Or you can sell it, but you won't find a customer that is willing to pay for it. And this is actually quite ingrained in the way the open source community works. It's quite common that people are offering custom development on code that other people have wrote, or services. I can help businesses who run a service that is developed by the community, for example. And this goes back to licensing as well, because open source licenses say every user can use this code for any purpose. There's no restriction to that, right? If you try to restrict that, you're not open source. And that means it's very difficult to sell something that's clearly on an open source license. And you find a lot of attempts like multi-licensing, they already fall out of favor over time, because in the end, people realize that what you're really trying to do is you're reintroducing vendor lock-in. And that's not a healthy community. And I said earlier, for example, for a business, the health of the community is a key decision point for whether or not I use a piece of software. So, products versus services. Now, businesses are tricky, right? They do find ways to benefit from the products they make. And some of these attempts are well thought out, and some of these attempts are not so great. And the intellectual property frameworks offer a lot of angles to kind of attach open source licensed code with other things that restrict what you can do with it. And so we talked about CLAs. Some projects require CLAs where you have to agree to give somebody a non-exclusive license to use your code commercially to be able to contribute to a piece of code. Contributor license agreement is the term. So basically, all contributors are equal, except one. One is more equal than the others, owns all the commercial rights and can sell the product. That, in some cases, this works, but it does leave us like a strange taste on the tongue, right? Because it's not really open source. Trademarks are sometimes used to force people to use open source software in a certain way. And the interesting thing here is to understand that the open source license makes the code free. So you can use the code, but using trademarks, vendors can say, you can use my code and call it something that I have the trademark for, if you agree to these terms. And then you can nudge your customers in a certain direction. Patents are a special issue. I've worked for a very, very long time, almost 8 years, in the open source and patenting community at the Open Invention Network, where we create a cross-licensing agreement to protect open source from patent litigation. There are some interesting activities there, and they're very hard to describe. For example, similar to standards development, there are entities that are participating in development processes solely to understand where innovation happens and file patent applications on it. So that's very unfortunate, and that leads to unpleasant patent litigation, like we have seen with the GNOME Foundation, where we try to help, or with Mycroft AI currently, where open source efforts are milked, attempted to be milked by patent trolls. And that's not a great environment. And I think it's almost like it's an abomination of the patent system when it's combined with open source. It's just these two things don't mix very well. And the most extreme case here is the combination of standards development and standard essential patents. SEP on the slide stands for standard essential patents. This is where especially large businesses participate in the development of standards that are then mandatory to be used, for example, telecommunication standards. However, the way the standards are written, you need a patent license from those companies that wrote the standards. And since there's only one European Union or continent, and the telecommunications need to be interoperable with everything, that basically boils down to a license to print money, because everybody who wants to offer a mobile phone now has to license standard essential patents. And that also very effectively so far inhibits the development of open source technologies in such a space. So there are no widely adopted, for example, open source based telecommunication stacks. This all boils down to differentiate or collaborate. This is the industry mantra that I have repeated for years, and that people, for example, in the foundations are, I think, adopting as the way, as a guiding line for how to work. Either what you create as a product, what you invest in, is differentiating towards consumers. then you focus your research and development efforts on it, and unfortunately, most of that is then proprietary, or it is not, and then you collaborate with others, and you save a lot of cost. This is the most impactful guidance for, especially for businesses thinking about which parts of their product to develop as open source versus which parts of the products to develop proprietarily. We have some interesting counter arguments that especially people from the community like to bring, so I'm going to go through this quickly. For example, I have invested our time, so we are entitled to be paid. Nope. If you're entitled to be paid, it's decided in the market, and usually people just like to use the code without paying for it. Somebody must pay me for this because it benefits them. That's the question of differentiation. I can offer a service, I can write a piece of code and publish it, but that doesn't mean that somebody has to come to me, for example, to even maintain it. Maybe I'm a socially awkward person and they like to work with somebody else who is good at coding. So there's basically no direct connection between the original developer and the user. This connection has to be created using differentiation. My code is very elegant, or it's written in Rust. That should matter to the user. No, users don't care about things like that. Users don't care what operating system your device runs. They buy devices based on color. My wife wants the red device. I'm getting the red device. I'm going to speed up because we're out of time and the slides are shared. There are many approaches that work very well in the saving money space. We have the large open source foundations that work this way. Platforms are developed this way. We have the ability to create industry standards by doing collaborative development. Interoperability is, of course, a very important aspect. And traditionally, interoperability was created by using standards development. But today we say we can actually also create interoperability by creating a single implementation that everybody uses. And that sometimes it's just a better way to reach consensus than to write a document that then needs to be implemented. There are ways to make money with open source, horizontal services, offering custom development, things like that, vertical integration, and then a lot of proprietary applications or devices are based on open source foundational technologies. It's important to keep in mind here that services are not free of charge. We said open source licenses make the product itself free, but that's also because a copy of a piece of software can be made with no cost. However, if you ask somebody to invest an hour of their time, you do need to expect to pay for that. And that's why there are many companies in the open source space that offer horizontal services, custom development, maintenance, etc., expertise, and they sell this by the hour and they make good money with it. There's some difficult approaches. It's very difficult today to be all proprietary, to basically create a software stack from the bottom to the top that is completely proprietary. The reason for that is that when you do that, everybody else is able to use open source foundational technologies. And that means everybody else is going to be cheaper than you. So going towards open source for foundational technologies is kind of a one-way street. Once a technology emerges, it becomes imperative for all the competitors to use it, or they have to invest more than the others and their products are more expensive. That's why we see a trend that open source technologies, they're innovative and then they become very widely used and commodity, and then there's no room left for a commercial product in such a space. And we always spoke about multi-licensing or dual licensing. It's a model that worked in a few exceptional cases. It worked okay, but it's still rather specialized, and I would be very careful with starting new multi-license projects in 2020. Yeah. Another thing that comes up a lot is licensing, and we should enforce the behavior of actors based on open source licenses. That's one way, but it's not the only way. There are other ways to create trust. There are other ways to create push behavior. For example, we have this question of cloud software. But what if somebody runs open source software on the cloud? Do I know that it's run in an unmodified way so that I can trust it? The answer is there, for example, audits to do that. The question is, do you trust the auditors, right? You can make contracts. You can have a service level agreement that says, I only pay for this if you guarantee to me that you're not using my data for something else. And for example, contracts combined with audits are a very traditional way in the industry to enforce behavior. As the open source community, we should keep in mind that enforcing license compliance is only one way to achieve behavior, but the best way to achieve license compliance are well-learned social norms. If everybody knows how to behave, most people will behave properly. It's difficult to mix sharing social transactions where you give something for free and you expect similar behavior from others with market transactions. So that's why it's difficult to multi-licensing, for example, is difficult because of that. A price of 0 triggers different responses in people than a small price. Even if you say you can have the software module for €1, like an app in the App Store, you're still buying a commercial product. And if it's broken, you will complain to the maker. If you get something for free as a piece of open source software and it's broken, you say, I'm writing email to the author and offering my advice. And that's this idea of reciprocity and fairness. And it also triggers an expectation of being an equal among peers between the contributors. So the concept of 0 price that is embedded in software freedom makes contributing to open source a social transaction. And social transactions are slightly different very different from market transactions. And it's difficult to mix both. So basically things like bounty programs that say, I'm going to pay you if you fix a bug in a piece of open source software. They kind of make contributing to open source a market transaction and take out the expectation of fairness and reciprocity. All right. Thank you. This was a tour de force talk, and I think we have a few minutes left for questions, so I'm very happy to hear them.
Okay, Mirco, thank you. Yes, we have a number of questions. Okay, the first one is about goals for using open source products. So the question is it possible to have several goals at the same time, for example, save and make money? Or it's always like it differs all the time. You either save money or either make money, and it can be combined. You can have like multiple wins.
I think the question highlights one point that's very important. That is, if you work in a collaborative way, the contributors you have to your project are not uniform. They have different goals, individual goals, or maybe they're companies, and different interests. So the assumption should be that first you work together because there's a shared interest into technology. Now, if your interest is to, for example, offer commercial services on top of that, you're primarily working based on your own expertise. If your interest is to build products that use the technologies as foundations, your interest is in, well, making sure the software works as well as possible, right? So when you run an open source community, it's difficult to, or when you're involved in an open source community, it's difficult to ingrain such expectations in the governance of the community. The community should work together to create the software so that it has the quality, sorry, and functionality that the users need. And it should create it in a way that the software can be used in the different environments of your different classes of users or contributors. So my recommendation would be to not try to mix the expectation how the software is going to be used, even commercially, with the governance of the community. Have the community work in a way that can produce the software in the best possible way, and make sure that you can use it then in your commercial setting. And that's a very simple statement to a very difficult problem, because every community is slightly different. And one key aspect here is that since everybody participates voluntarily in the community, you can't force anybody to have a certain behavior. People always are free to walk away and not participate anymore, which means that many communities apply consensus as a driving principle. And consensus is very difficult because it practically gives every individual contributor a blocking vote. I hope that answered the question. It's quite a complicated answer, sorry.
Yes, okay. Okay, the next question, quite interesting. It's about an issue in the game development space. Example is when we start with open source game engine, and then the, let's say, owners, they change the license on their systems after developers had lock-in. So what do you think? What is your thoughts on these changes in license? Where you basically start out with a free sample and then addict it into the next edition.
There are multiple ways this can happen. One is, actually most common, unfortunately, is that some engine, for example, starts as an open source product, and then the makers decide that future versions, they will not release as open source anymore. I said earlier, something that that is open sourced once cannot be taken back, but that only covers all the way to the revision that was published. If the makers decide from tomorrow on, we are going to make this proprietary, then you can use up to that revision for free, and then you can't get updates anymore from them. That happened a couple of times in the industry, and it's always when people realize that their dream of making this open source is kind of contradicts with their necessity to earn a living. And there's no advice here except you can stick with the engine and the version that was released as under open source licenses, and rethink how you develop the game that you're developing, because it's probably a commercial product. The other possible approach here is an open core model, where core parts of the engine are released as open source, but some key parts are not. Where you can start your project based on the core parts, but you realize quickly that to actually release like a game into the market, you need access to the other parts as well. That's called open core. That is not the whole product is open source, just the part that gets you hooked, right? And legally, there's no way to prevent that from happening. From an ethical perspective, I think it's not open source, right? You're getting something that is not fully functional. So you can read up, for example, on various free software policy groups on the question of open core, and it's a difficult problem. And some commercial products that are not game engines, but for example, customer relationships management software, etc., are developed in such a model where the core is free, and then you have to buy additional modules to actually make it useful. Difficult question. It also requires usually contributor license agreements where one entity holds all the copyright or has access to all the copyright for commercial use, creates asymmetry between contributors. So it's a bad situation. It's difficult to give advice here, except that my advice would be if you plan to release the results of your work as open source projects. For example, you make a free game that is supposed to be under a clear open source license. Only use open source dependencies. If you plan to sell it, then you have a revenue stream and you may be able to pay for commercial licenses, and your product is not free anyway. But software that's free should be built from free components.
Okay. Well, next question. About the processes. So you talk a bit about the development process, and the question is, okay, we have for now the flourish of agile frameworks, yes, of agile processes. Also, we have traditional approach, but what about open source development? So it looks like it's neither agile nor traditional. So could you give a could you characterize this process somehow? What is it? What is the principles, basics, like, I don't know, open source manifesto development?
Okay, do you have another hour? No, I can try to give a quick answer, but I really think this is a separate subject that totally warrants another talk. There's a traditional way for managing industrial innovation, like waterfall, V model, and we have agile approaches that are very popular because a lot of the innovation we see today comes in software. We have to keep in mind that things like the waterfall model were invented to make ships, right? A different process. For example, if there are it's easy to fix a bug in the software, where it's much harder to re-raise a ship that sunk when it was launched because you made a mistake. So a lot of the safeguards that were involved in these traditional processes, they were in place because you couldn't revert the results, right? And so it's easy to say, oh, we should all be agile. But we have to keep in mind that the assumption in agile is that if we make a mistake, we can fix it without a lot of cost. And that makes this development process, applicable to some products, but not to all. So I wouldn't use an agile approach overall to make a warship. Now, how does this relate to open source collaboration? I would say it has nothing to do with it. Because what we're talking about when we're talking about waterfall versus agile are development organizational processes. And open source collaboration is, again, like an independent access here. It's how do you manage access to the code? How do you share the code within your organization and with others? How can people that have an idea, for example, how to do something better, contribute that idea to the overall code base? So what you're doing is you're creating an environment where ideas can flow freely and where changes and improvements can be aggregated into the product. That's the open source way. And you'd be surprised, even in large organizations today, that it's not common, for example, that code is shared between departments. There are still walls in between. So in introducing open source collaboration in such an environment can make a lot of things better, because all of a sudden you can contribute, you see where there's duplication of effort, etc. But you can do that while your overall product, say it's a ship, is still developed under a waterfall model. And that's why I say agile and open source, they're a great combination, but they're not necessary together, not necessarily together. I believe that open source collaboration offers an improvement in the efficiency of of creative processes by orders of magnitude over central management. The possibility to remove the central authority from the process allows people to be creative, to be recognized for their own ideas, even if they're the smallest intern in the company, right? And that's what companies should do, or organizations should do, is they should allow everybody to be as good as they could possibly be. And that's what open source collaboration supports. But my recommendation is to separate mentally between, for example, the approach taken to the overall organization of a large complex project, especially if it has quality gates, for example, that cannot be reversed. So you reach a step, you launch the ship, and if it sinks, the project is over, right? So, so this needs to be separated from collaboration methods on the actual product. And we also need to keep in mind that with open source collaboration, we can efficiently create information, right? Write code. We can work on hardware designs, for example, together. We can even collect documentation. But making physical products is not very well supported based on open source collaboration methods. Because one of the assumptions in open source collaboration is always, and if I find a typo in the text, I can go and change it. Now, if I've made a ship, then it's difficult to change the door that's in the wrong way. So very long answer, short. Project organization and open source collaboration are separate aspects, and Agile and open source go very well together.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Mirco. So actually, we have run out of time now, and we have to move to our session. And thank you for this good talk. And if it is possible, we have some more questions in the chat. If you have some time, it would be great if you could answer them in the chat later. And now, thank you, and go forward. So now I give the word to session chair,
Thank you very
Professor
much.
Manuel Mazzara. Mirco, thank you. Goodbye.